Shall we start?
Yeah.
You want a few pictures?
No, I have some.
Yeah. Good afternoon. This is the seminar that accompanies the panel lectures. Usually it happens often at the end of both lectures, but we find that there is, for very good reason, an exodus at that point. Everybody wants to get back to their lives, so we thought this time we would change it and have it in between. There is, of course, a second lecture that we've not heard, although you gave us many indications of where the lecture would go in response to Evelyn and in your own work. So, good afternoon. We will now have a comment. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and then we can have an open discussion.
All right, well, so first of all, I just want to say that I am totally thrilled to be here for Professor Roberts' lectures, and thank you very, very much to the committee for inviting me. And so I have about 20 minutes, so I'm going to try and take my 20 minutes, and then we'll just be open for discussion, and I hope the comments will spark discussion that really maybe carries forward some of the themes that were raised yesterday in Professor Roberts' lectures, and then the discussion afterwards. So her lectures focus our attention on contemporary science that claims to explain the relationship between social inequality and disparate biological outcomes. And in contrast to what she describes as the old biosocial science, this new version inverts the causal relationship between biology and social inequality by attending to mechanisms through which social inequality creates biological difference and gets into our bodies. As Professor Roberts notes, the new approach melds together the biological and the social. It has the potential, I would say, to deconstruct and reconfigure many sorts of dichotomies that are currently assumed or explicit even in our culture, such as the inside and the outside of bodies, the mind versus the body, the human versus the non-human, and of course the social versus the biological, and many others, depending on exactly which domain of the science we're talking about. And many of us have high hopes for this kind of science, high hopes that it could move forward projects on social justice, right? But I think particularly in the work that Professor Roberts is going to discuss this afternoon, she raises some, she identifies the promise, but also will raise some cautionary flags. And I think the cautions are well warranted, so what I want to do is perhaps talk about two additional reasons, things that, at least in the written materials that we received, were not really discussed, two additional reasons for at least caution in thinking about whether the new biosocial science is going to live up to its promise with respect to at least providing new kinds of knowledge that would justify some political action to ameliorate inequality, right? And so we have to be asking, if the research is not providing those kinds of knowledge, why not? If it's not asking the right kinds of questions, why not? So I'm going to focus on 2 points, and in particular I want to think about reasons why race concepts have been very sticky in the biosciences. So this issue came up a couple of times, particularly in the discussion yesterday. Why is it, or the fact that race has just, in one form or another, right, it changes, and that's one of the things Anne Morning has pointed out to us, is that exactly what counts as race is how we measure them and so forth, changes over time. But some kind of concept of race has been very sticky in the biological sciences. And so I want to talk a little bit about sort of recent conceptions of race in the biosciences and what might make them sticky. And so my first point has to do with institutionalization. A lot of the research that we're talking about here, in particularly the molecular aspects of it, is conducted by biomedical researchers who are funded through organizations with missions that focus on biomedical research. It's carried out within organizational structures that are devoted to biomedical research. And all of this means that the institutional practices, norms, ideologies, patterns of behavior that already exist in these organizations, that already motivate the funding of biomedical research, all of those are still in place, and the new biosocial science is going to have to operate to some extent within those organizational structures and institutions. And so there are many ways that the uses of race are institutionalized in the bioscience. And here when I talk about institution, I'm really drawing a lot on the work of Ian Lopez. So I'm a law professor, so in legal scholarship we talk about the new institutionalism having really come into force in the scholarship in probably the mid-1990s to the early 2000s. So it's not all that new, but compared to the old institutionalism of like the mid-20th century, right? And so really, Professor Lopez, who was at one time here, I think as like a legal master's student or something. He had an appointment here briefly. So he had an article that came out in the Yale Law Journal in 2000 where he really tried in quite an elaborate way to develop a theory of institutional racism. And so his work has deeply influenced me, I would say. So, and so when we think about this, we're thinking about institution as denoting a common set of norms, practices, and patterns of behavior. Repeated patterns of behavior become routinized, right? They take on a kind of rule-like status, and ultimately people follow them in a kind of unthinking way, because that's what I do when I do biomedical science, right? As these routines become institutionalized, they delimit the boundaries of what is organizationally appropriate. They specify organizational and individual identity, right? So what it means to be a biomedical scientist is to do these certain things to some degree. And so yesterday, when Professor Roberts described biomedical researchers as often using racial classifications in unexamined ways and without reflexivity, I would argue that one of the reasons for such unthinking uses is that particular kinds of uses of race have been institutionalized, one in the biosciences. And one of the ways they've been institutionalized in the biosciences, and one of the ways in which recent conceptions have been institutionalized is through legal mandates. And so we're not really concerned so much about law on the books, but law as it is enacted by people in their everyday lives and in their organizational policies and so forth. So the relevant law that I am thinking about is law relating to the NIH-funded research, to FDA-regulated research, law that has to do with the inclusion of women and minorities in science. And so this is law that applies to all human subjects research, and that is, there are very specific legal and institutional definitions of human subjects research that we don't have to get into now, so it might not cover exactly what you would think it covers, but it covers enough, right? And so, of course, this law is law and policy that applies across health and human services. And almost all of the biomedical research that we're talking about is funded, sponsored, or regulated by some unit within the agency, Health and Human Services, right? And across HHS and other units of government, all units of government are required or strongly encouraged to use categories of race and ethnicity that were developed by the Office of Management and Budget and promulgated in its 1997 Directive 15, so OMB Directive 15. And in that directive, and in the instantiations that occur in the different agencies, the OMB says explicitly that these categories are, the categories in this classification, this is a quote, are socio-political constructs and should not be interpreted as being scientific or anthropological in nature. The standards have been developed to provide a common framework for uniformity and consistency in the collection and use of data on race and ethnicity by federal agencies. And so, probably many of you know this, but there are two ethnicity categories only, that is Hispanic and non-Hispanic. There are 5 racial categories. These are American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Black or African American, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and white. And the big innovation in 1997 was to disaggregate Pacific Islander from Asian, because there used to be 4 racial categories, and Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian were included within Asian. And so in 1997, those categories were disaggregated. And all agencies are actually sort of directed methodologically to collect this information in a certain way, which is to first collect information on ethnicity, and second to collect information on race, and to collect that information by asking people how they identify, right? So this is actually a government-wide mandate, and then that mandate is built in various ways into the legal rules that govern the different science funding agencies. So for instance, for NIH, in 1993, the NIH Revitalization Act directed the NIH to produce guidelines on the inclusion of women and minority in science. And when those guidelines came out, and they have since been modified in various ways, but one of the things about them is that they go beyond the notion of inclusion, and in some cases they require that racial and ethnic subgroup comparisons be conducted and reported back to the agency. In other cases, they don't require it, but they, quote, strongly encourage it. So we went from inclusion, which for a variety of political purposes could be important regardless of the biological meaningfulness or the meaningfulness of these particular racial categories for any scientific project. There are still good reasons to be inclusive, even if those racial categories have nothing to do with outcomes in a particular scientific experiment, right? So, but we went from inclusion to data analysis using these categories as part of the legal mandate. The guideline describes the OMB categories as a minimum standard for data collection, one that doesn't prescribe that this is the only way to do data collection or analysis, that doesn't prescribe that these 5 categories and comparisons among them be used in the scientific reports, in the journal publications. But there is some data, I think it's not super strong, some empirical data suggesting that the mandates to use these categories have resulted in more papers reporting in the scientific literature using these categories. And again, in some ethnographic research, I and some other people have data suggesting that these categories, the use of them really has been routinized, right? That it's just something that you do, and you do it in part because you have to do it to report it to NIH at the end of the day. But the problem is, then you don't go beyond that, and you don't think beyond that, because this is the routine thing that we all do, right? So in addition to the NIH, the FDA also has regulation requiring the reporting of at least, so the regulation technically only applies to drug development, but in guidelines, FDA has said that device development should also include reporting of data by what they call demographic subgroups. Their demographic subgroups are age, race, and gender, and other subgroups as appropriate. And sponsors have to do comparisons across the demographic subgroups, report those to FDA, and they also have to report whether modifications of dosage or dose intervals are needed for any subgroup. So in 2012, so that's been in FDA's regulation for a long time. In 2012, in a modification of the FDA law called FDASIA, or that's how we refer to it, That's actually an acronym for a very long act that modified the FDA law a little bit. So in FDASIA, Congress directed the FDA to investigate whether and to what degree sponsors of new drug applications really were using these categories and really were conducting the regulatorily required comparisons, and then to develop a plan, an action plan for improving and increasing the demographic subgroup reporting and analysis, right? And as part of that plan, FDA put out 2 guidances, one to the device community and one to the drug manufacturing, drugs and biologics community. The drugs and biologics one came out this week, okay? So, and in that, FDA stresses that it's mandatory and not voluntary to collect data on race and ethnicity, that the OMB categories must be used. It has a separate guidance on how to collect data in other countries, not the US, and to make those data comparable to the US categories. And it states that even though these categories were not developed by OMB as biological categories or anthropological categories, that it's important to standardize data collection across many studies so that the FDA and sponsors of drugs and others can look for signals of safety by demographic subgroup. In other words, the idea being that when you're doing drug studies, maybe even after a drug has gotten on the market, we want to be able to do meta-analysis and aggregate across a lot of studies to see whether African Americans or Hispanics might be having more bad side effects, right? And potentially you might also see differences in efficacy, but I think it's less what they focus on and might be harder to see, frankly. And just as an aside, a lot of that kind of work, FDA and the community of statisticians are still trying to figure out how statistically to do good studies of this sort where you're using aggregates of various kinds of health data, not in a clinical trial, to really, more accurately identify signals of safety problems. So I bring all of this sort of regulatory and legal framework up to say that I think, well, first of all, I want to say with respect to FDA and truly also with NIH, I think there's a lot of work to be done in tracking the slippage between the use of categories for political purpose to track inclusion and potential marginalization of social groups, and then slippage into conducting scientific subgroup analysis and doing meta-analysis across studies, because that idea seems to suggest that there's something, for instance, essential to all Black people, no matter what part of the US or what part of the world they came from, that is likely to influence drug response or more likely to influence drug response than other kinds of demographic and social information we could be measuring, right? And so I think there is work to be done to really elucidate how that slippage has happened. And I think it's there, and I think it pushes us back towards some pretty, Blumenbachian, simple-minded notions of race and biology. But I also think that sort of these requirements for, and I should also point out that these requirements for the use of the tracking of inclusion, these were pushed by primarily women's health activists in the early 1990s. Who had looked in the data produced by NIH and determined that women were being essentially excluded from a great deal of biomedical research. And oh, by the way, so were people of color. And one of the interesting things, I've done some, sort of archival research on this, and one of the interesting things is that with respect to race, as far as I can tell, really the early activists pushing Congress to write these laws requiring inclusion were mostly all around women's health, but when they testified in front of Congress, they would always use the phrase women and people of color or women and minorities. And it was very late in the game, for instance, when the Congressional Black Caucus came on board to support these laws. So that's just, I think the proponents of these legal mandates were motivated by really important and positive and progressive concerns about inclusion in science, but sometimes those good motives can lead to really unexpected outcomes, right? And in this case, I think one of the things it's done is led to a kind of ossification of racial categories. But it goes beyond that, right? So the routinized use of racial and ethnic categories has led to situations where even biomedical scientists who are self-reflective about their uses of race, the ones who come to me to talk about it, some of them, may nonetheless use those categories, and not just use them in their analyses, but report those analyses in the scientific literature, because when they don't, then other people feel like, I can't compare my data to yours. And so then my papers are not going to be cited as much if I don't use those categories that everybody recognizes that have become entrenched in the literature, right? And this is one of the ways that institutionalization happens and perpetuates those categories, is that even people who might be reflective enough to think about using different categories or to think that these categories might not be that meaningful, still have incentives that come from the structure of scientific publishing to continue using those categories. I also think that this routine use of the categories actually goes to one of my questions about the whole concept of biosocial science, and particularly the kind of biosocial science that you want us to think about. Because even studies that don't start out wanting to contemplate how social inequality gets into our bodies might end up making claims about that, but claims that focus particularly on race and certain ethnicities just because they have to gather the data on race and ethnicity, but they don't have to gather more sophisticated data on things like class, immigration status, or other aspects of the social condition that might influence people's biology.
And they're not funded to do that.
And they're not necessarily funded to do that, right?
Never.
So to
right.
do those,
Never.
well,
yeah.
you might be, but to do those kinds of studies, you have to be intentional about it, right?
Right?
You have to design the study to look at that,
that's right.
submit it
That's
to
right.
the study section, and get it funded. Whereas for race and ethnicity, you have to collect those data. Everybody has to collect them. So people don't necessarily start out with any hypothesis about social inequality when they're doing the research, but they end up making claims about it sometimes anyway. And those claims attract a lot of media attention, either because they resonate with people's common sense notions of race, or in some cases, a few cases, because they have economic implications, right? So Jonathan Kahn has written a lot about the drug Bidil, and the fact that a drug that was otherwise failing to show efficacy, probably in sort of overall across all demographic subgroups, probably because of not well-designed studies, because they saw signals of efficacy in African American populations, they then went and did studies only in African Americans, got the drug approved with labeling that allows them to market specifically to African Americans, right? So this was a way economically to rescue a drug that otherwise might not have ever made it to market. And finally, I would say that, have I already said this? Well, so just to finally make the point that the routinization of race and ethnicity and the collection of data and analysis of data using these sort of 5 racial categories and 2 ethnicities, what it does is it emphasizes those categories. And so to go to a point that Dorothy is well known for making, it's that it makes other kinds of information seem less salient to people and less salient in the community as a whole, right? I also think we can see here a kind of feedback loop between the broader society and the biology institutions, right? Because people who were lobbying for these inclusion laws, they were operating on a kind of common sense notion of race, right? Congress operates on a kind of common sense notion of race, and then that common sense notion of race gets instantiated in the law and regulation, and that feeds back into the production of knowledge along those same lines, right? So that's all I'm going to say about that aspect of institutionalization. Very briefly, because I know I've been probably going on way too long, I want to talk about one other thing, which is the move in biosciences to big data science, right? So we're living in that era where we have high throughput molecular technologies, an ever-increasing access to computational power and cloud storage, at least in the privileged research institutions, and the rise of big data analytics, right? And all of that has come together to create a kind of bandwagon of big bioscience in which particular experiments analyze data from tens of thousands of people sometimes, analyze tens of thousands or even millions of data points per person, so that's high dimensional data. Analyze increasingly heterogeneous data sets where data from different domains, much of it not originally generated for research, is gathered together to create a data set. So some of those kinds of heterogeneous data, of course, include electronic health records, include, even in the health sciences, include things like credit scores, and then machine learning algorithms learn patterns in the data, right? And learn patterns in data that combine molecular information with these other kinds of information. Unless you think that I'm sort of out on a limb with the whole credit score thing, in 2014 there was an article published in PNAS by Solomon Israel at Duke and his colleagues, which was titled Credit Scores, Cardiovascular Disease Risk, and Human Capital, in which they purported to find that a low credit score was associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease, and they hypothesized that the underlying connection was that individual differences in educational attainment, cognitive ability, and self-control both cause low credit scores and high risk of cardiovascular disease. Yes, yes, indeed. And so why am I talking about big data science, and how is that relevant to the prospects for breaking out of 20th or pre-20th century notions of race, or the prospects of generating maybe the best information we can using the new biosocial science? Well, I mean, I think any of us who thinks about it for a minute realizes just how completely all kinds of real-world data is infested with the social inequalities, right? So if you just think about health records, you know, social status, socioeconomic status, influences who goes to the doctor, how often they go to the doctor, whether they can get the drugs that they need to be taking, and therefore how their biologies manifest the next time they go to the doctor, right? In all kinds of ways. Of course, credit scores, I mean, I don't even have to talk about that, right? There are all kinds of ways, or we can talk about that later, right, that social inequalities are baked into these real world data. And we're only just at the early stages of data scientists trying to figure out how we can look at data sets or look at algorithms that are trained on these data sets and understand when the machine learning algorithms are basically learning existing social inequalities and injustices, right? But my concern is that this kind of science actually has the potential to direct, for instance, healthcare in ways that reproduce or potentially even exacerbate the social inequalities, because it starts out learning those social inequalities and generating its knowledge from them. So that is one of my concerns, is how is the new biosocial science going to fit in with this kind of big data science approach, when it really, I think, has the potential to import existing social categories and inequalities. And then the very last thing I would say is that we have technology for doing high throughput production of molecular data, right? So whether it's genome sequencing, genotyping, RNA-seq, whatever it is, we have technologies for that. But I fear that the big data science approach, it can also make the social information more opaque, less apparent, in part because it's not clear that we have similar ways of gathering the sort of, we don't have similar big data technologies for gathering the social information. And so what we use are things like credit score databases, payment databases, and electronic health records, which are certainly not optimized for understanding how the social gets into the biological, right? And so we have on the one side these increasingly well-developed and really cool technologies for the molecular data. And on the other side, we don't have anything similar yet for the social data. So with that, I'm going to stop and just open up for conversation.
Professor Ossorio, thank you so much.